put up. Essentially, when we think about natural selection occurring, what is natural selection? That is the change in the alleles within a population due to selection pressures that are selecting for a specific allele, right? What needs to exist for natural selection to occur? There are four conditions that need to be met. What are these four conditions? One is that there is a natural variation that exists within a population. There needs to be variation of a specific trait or a specific allele within a population that gives, basically that variation needs to exist. Why does it need to exist? Because without a variation existing, a specific phenotype can't be selected for. If all of them were green beetle and the green beetles were hunted for, all of them would die out. Only if there is a variation that exists, there's some that are orange, some that are green, possibly one phenotype could be selected for and be passed on later on. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that there needs to be a selection pressure that impacts on the survivability and reproducibility of the organism in a population. Basically, something like predators, diseases, natural disasters, anything that is naturally occurring is considered a natural selection pressure. And this is going to impact on the survivability of the overall population. And that is required for natural selection to occur. The third thing is the selective advantage. Basically, when the selection pressure is acting on the entire population, one phenotype needs to have a selective advantage. Basically, if there's a population of green beetles and orange beetles, the selective advantage would go to the orange beetles because the green beetles are being hunted. So the orange beetles are being selected for, right? They have the advantageous phenotype, which increases their fitness, whereas the green beetles have a disadvantageous phenotype, which reduces their fitness. And then lastly is heritability, whether these green orange beetles can actually pass on their alleles, their phenotype to the next generation. That is the last thing that needs to happen. And these four conditions met together, it will in turn create natural selection, right? So let's think about this in terms of this example. So I'll run through this with you guys so that you have a sense of it. So make sure we can understand it, right? First is the variation in the population. What we think about the variation, we can see that there are some mice that are white, some mice that are black. This is the variation that exists within a population. What is the selection pressure that's acting on the mice? Basically, predators, and specifically these predators are, this is the fox. That is the selection pressure acting on the entire population. What is the selection advantage of a phenotype? We can see that the fox is selectively targeting the white mice and letting the black mice survive with a higher chance. That means that the selective advantage of a phenotype goes to the black mice because they are being selected for, and the white mice have a selective disadvantage because they are selected against. Okay. And lastly is heritability. Basically, the black mice are able to reproduce and pass on their traits to the next generation, allowing them to increase their total number in the population. And if you think about this in terms of alleles, this is what's happening, right? The trait is the phenotype. This is the genotype. Genotypes include the alleles. So if we think about it purely in terms of alleles, because one allele is being selected against versus one that is being selected for, the one that's being selected against will reduce, whereas the one that's being selected for will increase. Okay? So that are the four conditions. So now we're going to think about it in a few different examples, right? Okay, so let's think about this in terms of the this crows here. Okay, so let's think about the first one. What is the natural variation that exists? Now get Janita. Yeah, so there's a variation of green and orange beetles. What is the selection pressure that's acting on the population? Can I get Mayor? The crows, the predators, right? What is the selective advantage of a phenotype? Can I get Melinda? Orange beetles, because they love green beetles, so they are gonna select for the selective advantage of a phenotype goes towards the orange beetles. And as we can see, lastly, the heritability, which is that the orange beetles are more able to pass on their traits to the next generation, and over time you can actually see them influence the population, the gene pool, the allele frequencies within the gene pool. They are changing to select for the orange beetle, meaning that the alleles for the orange beetles are the primary, they're going to become the dominant one in that population. All right. So let's try this in a different context. So this one is actually showing you the allele frequency changing. So we have a population of blue and white bugs. Yeah, just call them bugs. Okay, that is the variation that exists. Second thing, what is the selection pressure? Basically, the selection pressure is that it favored dark beetles, dark colored beetles. Okay, so it could be just predators. The selective advantage is thus that it favored the dark beetles. So heritability means that the dark beetles would have a higher fitness compared to the light colored beetles. That means the dominant homozygous alleles are selected for, whereas the homozygous recessive alleles are selected against, and you can see how that changes the population in the next generation. Basically, if you calculated the allele frequency of the dominant trait or the dominant allele, it will have a higher allele frequency compared to the recessive allele. All right. I hope everyone has a decent understanding of this so far. So natural selection is driven to adaptation selected for through natural selection pressures, right? Basically, environment. How does the requirement of natural selection relate to survival of the fittest? So you guys have definitely heard the phrase survival of the fittest, right? That is a biological term. That's why they use the word fittest, because fitness in biology means that they have an increased survivability and reproducibility. That's why survival of the fittest, right? Do not think of it in a very uh, general sense that everyone keeps thinking of survival of the fittest as basically a general sense. Basically, if you're a fit person, you have a higher survivability. No, it's about fittest in the sense of biology, whether you have a survival selective advantage, whether you have a higher survivability and reproducibility, right? Selection pressures determine which phenotype is desirable, meaning that which uh, organisms are going to have a higher fitness will have a selective advantage. That advantageous trait becomes more popular in the allele frequencies over the next few generations because they are selected for. So what happens to genetic diversity, genetic variation as a result of this? So we've looked at the previous picture, right? Notice how variation existed. Then the green beetles are selected against, the orange beetles are selected for, and over time, you can see how the population changed. But what has happened to the population in the last picture? Is there any variation that exists anymore? That is a problem of natural selection as well. So what can happen to genetic diversity, genetic variation as a result of natural selection is that because the advantageous traits are being continuously passed on, this can lead to a low amount of genetic variation within a given population because only that one specific allele is passed on, the other allele is selected against, meaning that the variation is suddenly dropping. So what happens and why is that an issue? It can lead to inbreeding occurring, which also increases the chance of disadvantageous traits being passed on. And sometimes what is the issue with a low amount of genetic variation is that the first condition of natural selection is no longer present. Remember, the first condition of natural selection is variability existing within a population. So if suddenly there is no variability existing within a population, all of them have the same trait, then suddenly they can have a higher chance of extinction if a specific selective pressure is acting on them, right? Let me paint a picture for you guys. Basically, we start off with the green and orange beetles. The orange beetles are selected for, so their traits are passed on, leaving behind no variation anymore. So at this point, if a selection pressure that selects against orange beetles happen, what's going to happen to the population? They are going to go extinct because there's no variation existing in the population. So there's no other phenotype that can be selected for. And this one phenotype is selected against, meaning that entire population can go extinct because they are all orange. So they're all selected against. Only if there is variation that a specific phenotype might get selected for, meaning that they can pass on their traits and basically make sure the population doesn't go extinct. But if there's no variation and then suddenly a selection pressure that selects against that trait happens, they have a chance of actually going extinct, right? So this is, as you can see, within a population of lions, there's darker skinned lions and lighter skinned lions. There's variation that exists within a population. There's competition for limited amounts of resources, food and shelter. The lions that blend in better catch their prey easier because they are unseen. They have a better chance of surviving. So let's break it down. The variation is the skin color of the lion. And basically, what is the selection pressure is whether they can get prey, whether they can get food for themselves. What is the selective advantage is that the lighter skinned lions can basically blend into the surrounding of the environment that they're in compared to the darker skinned lions, which are more obviously going to be spotted, right? Because in a savanna, the color you're going to see is lighter. So the lighter skinned lions are going to blend in better. So they can hunt better compared to the darker skinned lions, which are going to be easier to be spotted. So after that, due to natural selection and due to the fact that the lighter skinned lions are going to have a higher fitness, they can pass on that trait more readily to the next generation. And in 100 years later, all the darker lions die of because will die off because it was harder for them to catch their prey. I'm going to zoom in since you guys can actually see that. So let's go through each of them again. So first, there's a variation that exists within a population, right? There's light-skinned lions and dark-skinned lions. And then there's a selection pressure that's acting on the population, which is how much food that they can get, how much prey can they get. And then if you look at the natural selection, selective advantage, obviously the lighter skin lions are going to be selected for because they can blend into their surroundings better compared to the darker skin, which are selected against in that environment, right? And then over time, the traits for the lighter skin lions are passed on. The heritability is present, so they are passing on the lighter skin trait compared to the darker skin lions, which have a lower fitness, meaning that they are not as able to pass on that trait, right? That's why 100 years later, you can see that the darker lions will die off. Their survivability is suddenly low compared to the lighter lions survive and are able to pass the light color gene to their offspring. And over time, there is no longer any variation that exists within the population. All the lions have suddenly become light color because that is the trait that was selected for heavily within that population. So essentially, the light colored in this movement. Okay, this is the point where natural selection has occurred and they are basically becoming a dominant the dominant trait within the population. But let's say suddenly, due to a drought, all the environment changes where the light skin environment is no longer present. So these lines are going to be easier to spot without any variation existing in the population. There won't be any other phenotype selected for. So they're all at a disadvantage, meaning that there is a chance the population can actually go extinct because natural selection can't happen anymore. Because the first condition of natural selection is that there needs to be variation existing. So natural selection can actually cut off its own tail by not allowing itself to happen if it happens to an extreme. Okay. And in that case, that's where mutations and other forms of uh, sorry, mutations and other factors can actually change your alleles. That's why they can be very important, because if you have a point where your entire population have the same alleles, you need something to change that up. That's where mutations can actually play a role. They can suddenly change the alleles within the population, and if that is an advantageous allele, it can be selected for once again, causing natural selection to occur once again. So that's why I say mutations, even though it can be a bad thing, it actually has a purpose in nature. Yeah, so like I said, environmental selection features can reduce the genetic diversity of a gene pool. So fitter individuals with alleles that code for advantageous phenotypes are more likely to survive and reproduce. So let's look at locus A. Notice that the diversity of the gene pool is leaning towards the genotype with allele A after natural selection. So that's the population of the beetles. Like I said, the darker color ones are going to be selected for compared to the lighter skin beetles, which are selected against. And we can see the genotype, it has the allele of capital A. So that is the allele that's going to be selected for. And the lighter skin beetles, lighter skin bugs have a allele which is the lowercase a, and that is the one that is going to be selected against. So selection pressures will be giving allele A, this capital A, the selective advantage. That's why you can suddenly see the gene pool after one generation is leaning towards that allele compared to the other allele, right? So as you can see, if this keeps following, if this trend keeps following, eventually you get to a point where only allele, the capital allele is present and the lowercase allele is no longer going to be present in the population, which is going to impact on the genetic diversity within that gene pool. Also, if you are still having trouble with this, yeah, the letter is usually referring to the locus. Whether it's capital or not is about whether it's dominant or recessive. Okay, make sure you're able to be aware of that. So why is losing genetic diversity a bad thing? Is because the first condition of selection pressure is variability. So if we lose that variability, then natural selection can't occur again, right? So if a population with a greater variation in alleles have a, so basically a population with a greater chance, greater variation in alleles have a higher chance of possessing favorable alleles that will help them survive in a new selective pressure. If suddenly there is only one type of alleles present, then there's a chance that that allele is going to be entirely selected against, which increases the chance of them going extinct, right? Yeah. Sorry, guys. All right. Conversely, population with low genetic diversity often at risk of extinction because their inability to adapt to changing environmental selection pressures, right? So low genetic diversity can also lead to high prevalence of any possible disadvantageous alleles being passed on. That is where inbreeding comes in.